The morning Audrey found the transfer confirmation on her husband's laptop. She was just trying to print a birthday card for her mother. She hadn't been snooping. She never had to snoop. That was the thing about Nathan. He'd always been careless in the way that men who believe they're untouchable tend to be. The laptop was open on the kitchen counter. The PDF was right there on the screen. $40,000 wired from their joint business account to a private account she didn't recognize, with a memo line that read simply, "For the apartment. Love N." She stood there in her robe, coffee going cold in her hand, and read it 3 times. Love N. She'd been married to Nathan Calloway for 9 years. 9 years of building Audrey's interiors from a 2-woman operation out of their spare bedroom into one of the most sought-after interior design firms in Charleston, South Carolina. 9 years of bankrolling his failed restaurant venture, his consulting phase, his brief obsession with becoming a property developer. 9 years of smiling at dinner parties while he took credit for her eye, her instincts, her relentless work. She closed the laptop carefully. She poured the cold coffee down the drain. Then she drove to work and did not cry until she was locked inside her private bathroom on the 3rd floor of the building she'd mortgaged her name to buy. That was 3 months before everything fell apart. She didn't confront him right away. That surprised her about herself. Audrey had always thought of herself as a direct person, someone who dealt with things head-on, who didn't let problems fester. But something made her slow down. Maybe it was the memory of what her mother had told her once, sitting on the back porch shelling peas. "Baby, when you find out a man is lying, don't let him know you know." Not yet. Find out everything first. So she waited. She watched. It didn't take long. His name appeared twice more in the business accounts over the next 6 weeks. Smaller amounts, but still. She hired a forensic accountant named Carl who wore a bow tie and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper, and Carl confirmed what she already suspected. Nathan had been systematically pulling funds from the business for at least 14 months. Consulting fees paid to shell companies, reimbursements for expenses that didn't exist, equipment purchases for a warehouse she'd never heard of. "We're looking at somewhere between $200,000 and $250,000, Carl said, setting a neat folder on her desk. "At minimum." Audrey nodded, like he'd told her the weather. She went home that evening and made Nathan's favorite dinner, pan-seared salmon with the lemon butter sauce he loved, and watched him eat it across from her, scrolling through his phone under the table with his left hand while he scooped rice with his right. He didn't look up more than twice. He said the salmon was good. He said he had an early call in the morning. She said, "Okay, honey," and cleared the table. That night, lying next to him in the dark, she stared at the ceiling and thought about the past 9 years in a new light. Every trip he'd taken for a deal. Every night he'd stayed late at the office. Every time she'd been too exhausted from a 12-hour day to notice the distance growing between them like a slow crack in a wall. She thought about the woman whose apartment that $40,000 had furnished. She didn't know her name yet. She would soon. Her name was Tessa. Audrey found out through the oldest method in the world. She followed him, not personally. She wasn't about to sit in a car outside some building like scene from a movie she'd be embarrassed to admit she'd watched. She hired a private investigator, a quiet woman in her 50s named Pat, who drove a forgettable gray sedan and had done this work for over 20 years. Pat gave her a folder within 2 weeks. Tessa Drummond, 28 years old, Pilates instructor. She had an apartment in the West Ashley neighborhood that was, Audrey noted, with a hollow kind of amusement, decorated in a style that looked distinctly like knockoff Audrey's interiors, warm neutrals, the kind of carefully arranged home that announced someone was trying to signal taste they hadn't earned. He described her aesthetic to her, Audrey thought. He sat across from me every night and then went and described my own taste to another woman. There were photos of them together. A restaurant Audrey had recommended to Nathan months ago because a client mentioned it. The same weekend Nathan had told her he was at a golf retreat in Hilton Head. Tessa laughing at something he said, her hand on his arm. Nathan looking relaxed in a way Audrey hadn't seen in years. She looked at those photos for a long time. Then she put them back in the folder and called her attorney, Her attorney was a woman named Diane Marsh who had built her practice on exactly these kinds of cases and had the quiet ferocity of someone who'd seen every variation of human cruelty and decided to weaponize that knowledge for good. Diane listened to everything, looked at Carl's report, reviewed Pat's folder, and then folded her hands on her desk and said, "Nathan has made some very serious mistakes." "I know," Audrey said. "The business account withdrawals constitute fraud, potentially criminal fraud, not just civil. We could involve law enforcement." "I know that too. What do you want to do?" Audrey had thought about this for weeks. She'd thought about it in the shower, on the long drive between client sites, in the 5 minutes before sleep when the mind runs wild and ungoverned. She'd thought about the version of herself that went scorched earth, the police, the public exposure, the whole ugly spectacle of it. She'd thought about the version that stayed quiet, took the settlement, and rebuilt in private. But there was a third version she kept coming back to. "I want to protect what I've built," she said, "completely. And I want him to understand exactly what he's losing before it's gone." Diane looked at her for a moment, then she smiled, which was unusual for Diane. "Then let's get to work." The plan was careful and took 6 weeks to execute. First, Audrey restructured the business. With Diane's guidance, she worked with her financial team to formally separate the personal and business assets in a way that had always been technically possible but never formalized, until now. Audrey's Interiors was placed into a corporate structure under her name alone, with documentation that clearly predated any divorce filing. The business Nathan had helped himself to like it was a personal checking account. Now it was airtight. Second, she quietly moved her personal assets, savings accounts, investments, the small piece of property her grandmother had left her in Beaufort that she'd always meant to develop and never had. All of it reviewed, all of it protected. Third, and this was the part that required the most self-control, she continued to act normal. She came home. She made dinner twice a week. She attended his friend's birthday party and smiled at all the right moments. She let Nathan believe that she was still his steady, reliable Audrey, too busy with work to notice anything, too tired to ask questions. She had always been the one who held things together. She'd let him believe that for years. It wasn't hard to let him believe it for 6 more weeks. The night she finally moved, she thought of it that way. The night she moved, like a chess piece crossing the board. Nathan had plans with Tessa. She knew because Pat had called her at 4 in the afternoon. He just checked into the hotel on Market Street, the usual room. She arrived 20 minutes ago. Audrey was in the middle of a client consultation when the call came. She excused herself, stepped into the hallway, listened, and then said, "Thank you, Pat," and went back inside and finished the consultation with complete focus. She approved fabric samples. She discussed sight lines and traffic flow and the way morning light would move through the space in winter. When the last client left, she called Diane. "Tonight?" Diane asked. "Tonight," Audrey said. The filing was ready. Had been ready for 2 weeks, waiting for this. Diane walked into the courthouse the next morning with a divorce petition, a civil fraud claim, and a motion for immediate protective order over business assets. Simultaneously, Carl's full forensic report was submitted to the relevant authorities. Nathan's attorney, Audrey, had already identified which one he'd likely call because Nathan was predictable in almost everything, received a copy of every document by messenger at 9 a.m. Audrey was in a meeting with a new client, a young couple renovating a historic home in the Ansonboro neighborhood, when Nathan called her phone the first time. She watched it ring and went back to discussing original plaster ceiling medallions. He called 11 times that morning. She answered on the 12th. Audrey. His voice had a quality she'd never heard before. Not anger exactly, but something close to it, wrapped around what sounded very much like fear. "What is this? What did you do?" "I protected my business," she said. "The way I should have done years ago. You're making a huge mistake. We can talk about this. Whatever you think you know, Nathan." She kept her voice so calm it surprised even her. "I know everything. I have documentation of everything. And my attorney is very, very good at her job." She paused. "I hope Tessa's apartment turned out the way you wanted. I hear the aesthetic is nice." The silence on the other end lasted long enough that she counted to 4. "Audrey," she hung up. The divorce took 8 months. It was not pleasant, and Audrey had not expected it to be. Nathan hired an aggressive attorney who made noise about her not being the sole force behind the business's success, about his contributions as a spouse, about a dozen creative arguments that Diane dispatched with the kind of calm, methodical precision that made Audrey grateful every single day she had her. The fraud case moved separately and more slowly, as these things do, but it moved. Tessa, Audrey was interested to learn through the proceedings, had known about the marriage from the beginning. She'd known for the better part of 2 years. There had been messages, produced reluctantly, after significant legal pressure, in which Nathan assured Tessa that Audrey was basically a business partner at this point, that they were staying together for financial reasons, that as soon as things were settled, Tessa would have everything. Tessa would have everything. Audrey read that in a deposition transcript one evening and had to set the papers down and breathe for a moment. Not because it hurt the way it once would have. It didn't by then. She breathed because of the specific shape of the lie, how familiar it was, how recognizable, how many women had sat in exactly this position, holding a piece of paper that described a future a man had promised to someone else while sleeping in her house and eating her food. She called her mother that night. "He was going to take everything," she said, not upset, just stating it. "I know, baby," her mother said, "but he didn't." He almost did. Almost is a long way from did. Audrey looked out the window of her apartment. She'd rented a place in the French Quarter neighborhood while the financial untangling continued, a beautiful high-ceilinged space that she'd furnished simply, with almost nothing, and found she loved it that way. The city lights were coming on outside. She could hear the faint sound of music from somewhere down the street. "I'm tired, Mama." "I know you are. Get some rest. You're allowed." She met Ronan Walsh about 5 months into the divorce proceedings. He was a structural engineer, brought in by a contractor on a historic renovation project Audrey had been commissioned to design. He was tall, quieter than she expected for someone in a hard hat and steel-toed boots, and he had the habit of thinking before he spoke, fully thinking, not just pausing for effect. That she noticed the first time he disagreed with a decision the contractor had made. He was right about the disagreement. She told him so. He said, "I wasn't sure you'd want to hear it." "I always want to hear what's true," she said. He looked at her like he was deciding something. "Okay," he said. "I'll remember that." She didn't think about him romantically for months. She wasn't thinking about anything that way. She was moving through her days with the focused quiet of someone doing reconstruction, of a building, of a life, of a self that had been quietly dismantled over years and needed to be looked at carefully before it could be rebuilt. But Ronan kept showing up, on the project which stretched over many months. With coffee sometimes, not as a gesture, just because he'd gone to get one and she was there and it seemed practical. With his considered unhurried way of speaking. With the way he listened when she talked, really listened, like what she was saying had weight, and he wanted to understand the shape of it. One evening, when there were the last 2 people on the job site, and the light was going orange over the rooftop, about how she sometimes found old houses more honest than new construction, he said, "What do you mean by that?" She tried to explain. The way historic buildings had been built to last, the way their bones told the truth about what they were, and he listened to all of it with that full attention of his. And then he said, "I think that's what you do for them. Tell the truth about what they are." She looked at him for a moment. "That's a generous thing to say about interior design." "I meant it about you," he said. And then, because he wasn't a man who made statements he didn't stand behind, "I think you're someone who's very good at seeing clearly. I imagine someone once took advantage of that." She didn't say anything. He didn't push. "I'd like to take you to dinner sometime," he said. "When things are less complicated. No pressure. Just, I'm saying it out loud so it's said." She nodded slowly. "Okay, it's said." The divorce was finalized on a Thursday in November. She took herself out for dinner that night. Not a celebration, exactly, just a marking of the moment. A quiet restaurant she loved, a glass of good wine, the shrimp and grits she'd been thinking about all week. She sat at the bar so she'd have someone to talk to if she wanted to, and no obligation if she didn't. She did not think about Nathan. She thought about the next project, a mid-century house in Mount Pleasant. She was just beginning to sketch in her mind. She thought about hiring a second senior designer because the workload had outgrown what she and her team could carry. She thought about her grandmother's property in Beaufort, which had been transferred to her name cleanly in the settlement, and what she might eventually do with it. She thought about Ronan and whether she would call him this week or the next. She called him that Saturday. They had dinner at a place on East Bay Street with good lighting and better food. And she told him more than she meant to. Not everything, just in a half. About what she'd found on the laptop. And what she'd done about it. About the particular exhaustion of having to dismantle a life at the same time as you were running a business and holding yourself together. He listened to all of it with that attention she'd come to expect from him. Did it go the way you wanted? He asked. She considered that. Mostly, there are things you can't get back. Time. The version of yourself that trusted without evidence. But you didn't lose what mattered most. No, she said. I didn't. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his for just a moment. Not dramatically, not with any grand intention, just a simple acknowledgement that landed with more warmth than she'd felt in longer than she wanted to admit. Then he moved his hand back and picked up the menu. The halibut looks good, he said. She laughed. A real laugh, the kind that surprised her. It does, she said. Nathan and Tessa lasted less than a year after the divorce. Audrey heard about it from a mutual acquaintance who seemed to think she'd want to gloat. She didn't. She listened politely, said something neutral, and moved on. She genuinely didn't need Nathan's misfortune to feel good about her own life. That was something she hadn't known about herself before all this. That she wasn't the kind of person who needed someone else to fail in order to feel like she had succeeded. The fraud case resulted in a judgment against Nathan the following spring. She didn't follow it closely. Diane kept her informed of the necessary details, and the rest she let go, the way you let go of a story that no longer needs you in it. Audrey's Interiors won a regional design award that same year for the historic Ansonboro renovation, the one she'd been in a meeting about the morning Nathan called her 12 times. The couple who owned the house threw a small party to celebrate, and they thanked her in front of everyone with such genuine warmth that she had to work to keep her composure. She stood in the finished living room afterward, long after most guests had left, and looked at what she'd made of the space. The original plaster medallion she'd insisted on restoring, the wide plank floors refinished rather than replaced, the furniture positioned to make the light move through the room the way it had been designed to over a century ago. It was honest work. It was work that told the truth about what the building was. She'd always known that about herself. She was good at seeing what things were, underneath what they appeared to be. She just needed to turn that same clarity on her own life. Ronan found her standing there and came to stand beside her without saying anything, the way he'd learned she sometimes needed. After a while, she said, "I'm thinking about the Beaufort property." "What about it?" "I want to build something there. Something of mine from the beginning. Not restored, new, but with the same intention." He looked at her sideways. "I know a good structural engineer. I've heard," she said. She reached over and took his hand. He folded his fingers around hers, and they stood there in the room she'd made, in the city she'd built her life in, and neither of them said anything else for a while, and the silence between them was the easy, settled kind that you only find with someone who has no interest in lying to you. She thought about the morning she'd found that transfer confirmation, how her whole body had gone cold, how she'd closed the laptop and driven to work and cried alone in a locked bathroom. She thought about who she'd been on that morning and who she was now. Not a victim, she thought, not a cautionary tale, just a woman who saw clearly, moved carefully, and came out the other side with everything that was actually hers. The party was ending. Voices drifted in from the hallway. The last of the evening light came through the west-facing windows and caught the old plaster walls and turned them gold. Audrey Calloway, soon to be just Audrey, soon to be whatever name she chose going forward, looked at the room one more time, squeezed Ronan's hand, and walked toward the sound of people she loved.